wanted this one on last week, so I'm going to start with this because I didn't get to it. But as we started a new year last week, and as we're heading into that new year a week now into it, I think the thing in terms of attitude that we need to have in the back of our mind is that it really is controlled by us. And when we look at the new year, we have 365, 4.5, however you know, or 5.5, or whatever it is, opportunities to be successful, to serve God, to have the correct attitude. And I think fundamentally that's where it all starts and where it all begins, is our attitudes as we move into the day, as we move into the new year, and as we move into the remaining portion of our life, whatever length that might be. So last week I set the stage for attitude. This week we're going to go into a deeper dive into each one of these Beatitudes. And last week after I got done with my class, just kind of a side note here, my wife asked me, she's like, so how do you decide what class you're going to teach? I'm like, well, I don't know. I just kind of look through some stuff, kind of read some stuff and decide, this is something I want to do. And she's like, well, do you ever coordinate with the elders? Do they ever ask you what you're going to do? I'm like, they never really have. I don't think they've had any issue. Maybe they do. But she's like, well, what about Sam? Do you ever worry that you're going to step on his toes? And I'm like, I don't really know that that's ever happened before. Well, the minute I said that, I go home and I see one of Sam's Bible minutes, and it's on the Beatitudes. So that's what I get. But I still have a positive attitude about this, even though Sam has already dealt with it. So today, blessed are the poor in spirit. And the first question is what does it mean to be poor? Lacking? Anything else? I mean, do we all have some understanding of what it means to be poor? I mean, in this country, it's probably a hard thing to really fathom what poor is. We might say we do, but I think our poor and being poor in the United States is different than being poor in some other parts of the world. Yes? Okay. And so you're trying to jump ahead in my class, but that's okay. But I think first and foremost, before we jump into poor in spirit, we have to define what is poor. And that's the fundamental point, is what is poor? I mean, it's one thing to say, yeah, we're poor, but what is it? And, as I looked through some things, and these are just a few items, it can be a multitude of things. It can be emptied. It can have nothing of worth, or it can be destitute, right? That's kind of how we would define it in terms of just poor by itself. And so the question then becomes is, are we poor? It's relative. Saw a hand in the back. Yeah. And you're definitely right. I mean, in terms of the biblical example of poor, it does, I guess, allow us to not be restrained by the money. When we look at poor specifically, and some Bible verses that define that, if someone's willing to look up James 2:1-4, someone else James 5:1-4, we can kind of get a good comprehension of poor in terms of the Bible. So James 2:1-4, and who would like to read that? Frank? Thank you. Yeah, and so obviously there's a whole lot more going on here than just defining poor, but we start to see kind of what poor in terms of this verse or these verses is, and that being, someone whose clothes may not look appropriate, right? Who kind of looks worn, dirty, ratty, right? What about chapter 5, verses 1 through 4? Someone have that. Mark? Yep. Yeah. So obviously this focusing more on what rich is, but to the opposite of that being poor. But looking to this, poor is having no money, having nothing specifically. But the main thing is there's nowhere to turn many times when you're poor. And when I say nowhere, there's only one direction to turn. And that's the wonderful thing about being poor in terms of God is we do cast our cares upon him. We do focus intently on the one place we can turn, where when we do have riches, when we do have wealth, when we have material possessions, we tend to focus on them. And so looking at Matthew 5, verse 3, and Matthew 5, verse 3. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Yeah. Sorry, I was just going to skip that one, but for some reason I didn't put that in there. But make sure I got the right verses here. I might have skipped some. Matthew 5:3, in terms of being poor in spirit, your gold and silver have rusted, and their rust will be witnesses against you, and will consume your flesh like fire. But the point of this being, and looking to what the Beatitudes specifically are, and that's where I probably should go. And of course, I didn't copy that verse down. Sorry, I'll get there in a sec. So that's where I want to be. I had the wrong verse copied down. So blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And that's where we're headed tonight in terms of what does it mean to be poor in spirit? And when we look at this verse specifically, and I have it listed up there, abandon pride and self-sufficiency, that only God can meet our needs, and that we seek to do God's will. But fundamentally, and the thing I have highlighted there, is that we're humble. What is that? What is humble? Yeah, Sam? And then that's a great definition and a great point. And you're right. It is humbleness is truly going to the to lowering ourselves to what many people would perceive as a weakness, but to the point of begging, to really focusing intently on what God provides to us. In Matthew 6, verse 33, it alludes to that. So, but seek first the kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. And so if we're humble, first and foremost, we're seeking him, right? We're not seeking self-gratification or higher status. We're seeking God. Now, the problem with being poor in spirit is our pride gets in the way, right? Are we prideful? Now, I know we've had some discussions about pride before in terms of can there be acceptable forms? And I'm going to try to work my way through that tonight. But when we look at man in general, man thinks he's self-sufficient. Man thinks he knows, right? Man thinks he's smart. Is man right? Going back to what we just talked about, humility says what? That we're not all those things, right? That we fall short, way short, not even really on the page with regards to God. And we admit that. We accept that. But man doesn't, right? We're constantly, as a society, as human nature, pursuing what? More knowledge, more manly knowledge, right? In terms of how we can discover how this was created, or this is done, or what this is, or we're looking for things that prove what? We're smart. We tend to focus our attention as a society away from what God really wants us to be focused on, being humble. That humility that he so desires in his children. Yeah. Yeah, and that's a great point. We are submitting everything to God, and we need to realize that. The cartoons that I put up here, I know you in the back can't read. I know, Rochelle, you're here tonight, so I'll make sure I try to catch them. But this cartoon, in my mind, kind of describes our society in terms of the gentleman here saying, what? All I said was, I'm proud of my humility. Is that a humble attitude? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so you're right. If you do win the most humble award and then you wear the medal, that could be a problem. So then the question becomes is, well, okay, what is self-respect? Is that different? How is self-respect different than pride? Let's look at Matthew 22, verse 39. Matthew 22, verse 39. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Pretty simple verse, right? But how does this show self-respect? Does it show self-respect? Yeah, exactly. So can we love others without self-respect? It's a difficult task, right? So poor in spirit helps us deal with properly the situations that we have to encounter in the world, right? So we're not proud, we're not arrogant, we're not haughty, but if we love our neighbor, we're going to be humbly respectful, right? Not boastful, arrogant. Yes, Sam? Yeah, yeah. Great point. And that was James. I don't know if I have that. James 12, Romans. Okay. Romans 12:3. Okay, yes. And I actually do think I might have that later on in this. But, you know, a few other verses that kind of go along with that. 1 Peter 2, verse 5. You also, as living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. So, in a humble manner, and the self-respect is, yeah, we're not just this garbage on the ground. God created us. God's growing us. God's helping us to get better. We should have some self-respect because of that. But as Sam alluded to, right, the basis of everything is that we're not overthinking it and overcompensating for maybe some of our less abilities. Yes, Jennifer. Yeah, hold that thought. First Peter, because I'm going to get there. So 1 Peter 2, 9 and 10 goes on to say, but you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. For you once were not a people, but now you are the people of God. You had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Self-respect. Do we have it? We should, right? God's great. God's wonderful. God's given us a bunch of opportunity. We should be mindful of that in our lives. Frank. Yeah. Yeah. Great points. And so I'm going to skip that last verse because my time is going quickly here and I've got a lot to get through. But pride in general, and this is the definition I pulled from Merriam-Webster, a feeling or deep pleasure or satisfaction derived from one's own achievements, the achievement of those whom one is closely associated with, or from qualities or possessions that are widely admired. And so when we look at pride in general, we see vanity, egotism, superiority, high opinion of oneself, and that putting ourselves in the position of God. And so that becomes the world in a nutshell, right? And the cartoon, can you read that one, Rochelle? Okay, so that one I don't have to read to you. That's good. But, and I use you, I'm not picking on you, but I just know that you will tell me if you can't read it. So we're prideful if we allow our accomplishments to define us. And what do I mean by that? We don't give the credit to God. Great answer, right? It if we allow them to our accomplishments to define us, it distorts our perspective of what's really important and what's not important, and we start to cling to the world. We start to grab onto those things that are temporary, that aren't important. Jennifer. Yeah. Yeah, and so and that's exactly it, is the the job, the grades, all that stuff, the youthfulness. Those things become things that we have pride in, that distort our perspective on what is really important. Why does that become so important to us? Yeah, we tend to respect what we look to as what other people are doing, right? And we start to respect those actions or those deeds or those possessions versus respecting the eternal life, versus respecting what God provides to us. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. We can easily be influenced by it. We can easily be led astray by it. We can easily be pulled in the direction we don't want to be. And that becomes the fundamental issue with pride. Yes. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Jesus is vital. What he went through, the life he lived, the death upon the cross, that's vitally important to us. And then Proverbs 16, verse 18, just alludes to this attitude. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before stumbling. If pride is that important to us, where are we going to wind up? Destitute, destruction. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. We tend to have that attitude of look at how good I am. Look at what I've done. Look at the important stuff. But the question, and it gets right to that point, is, are we prideful? Are we, as the children of God, prideful? And when I say that, let's look back. What about the Jews? Were the Jews prideful? How so? Someone want to look up Romans 1, 21 through 25 for me? Romans 1, 21 through 25, and then Matthew 3, 7 through 12, someone else, if you could look that up. And the reason I ask people to read is because I know you guys don't want to hear me talk the entire time. So Romans 1, 21 through 25. Who would like to read those verses? Mark. Yeah, and so were the Jews prideful? Yeah. Did they think they had it all figured out, that they knew what was right, and in many aspects thought they knew more and knew better than God? Yeah, what about Matthew 3, verses 7 through 12? And who would like to read that? PJ, go for it. Yeah, and so in the aspect here of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, right? Once again, prideful, right? Because they knew the word. They thought they were better than everyone else, carried themselves in that manner, and then started to initiate stuff that wasn't really in accordance with God's word. And then as we continue on, even as far back as Pharaoh, what was Pharaoh's issue? Yeah. And Pharaoh says in chapter 5, verse 2, but Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I do not know this Lord, and besides, I will not let Israel go." So pride has always been there. What about today? Are we prideful? Yes. Yes. Yeah, it doesn't. You're right. Yeah. Great. Yeah, and you're right. Without Christ, we have nothing. And you're right. It should keep us focused. Unfortunately, we're men, right? We make foolish decisions. We make stupid mistakes. And are we prideful today? Materialism is a prime example of that. Atheism, a prime example of that. The theory of evolution, a prime example of that, right? Ideas of man that this will make us happy, that there is no God, that we know all. Sam. Yeah. 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 Great point. And so definitely as the world, but what about individually? Do we have pride? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, and definitely. Yeah. And when we look, and those are great points, Dale, in terms of looking to Christ and maintaining that focus helps us so that we don't become prideful. But what winds up happening a lot of times to men in general is that we look upon our own self and our own moral goodness as something to be proud of. You know, oh, I'm glad I'm not like him or her or whatever, right? But this alludes to the understanding that we have no understanding of God's grace, right? And what God really does for us, because can we earn our salvation by how good we are? That's what we're losing the focus on. Sam. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, great points. And you're right. We can't overcome that sin, right? Whatever that sin is, however many sins it is, we can't overcome that without without Christ. And that carrying ourselves with that and ideal of, oh well, I can do enough and I'm good here, and so therefore I can compensate there for that bad situation. No, that's not what it's about. We can't carry ourselves with that type of pride in our lives, because it only starts to weigh us down. And sorry, Ron, I've mhm. Yeah, definitely. And Paul's a great example, right? Understanding. Yep. Yes. Yeah. Paul, who went through countless issues, right? Torture, torment, you name it. But what, right? Focus intently on serving God. And he felt like he wasn't, when you read through the letters he wrote, nothing came out that was, I'm better than you because of this or because of that. And that's a vital piece. 1 John 2, verse 15. Do not love the world, nor the things of the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. And that's the thing we have to keep in mind is Dale's alluded to it, Sam's alluded to it, Ron's alluded to it. What do we really love, right? And it goes back to pride is false humility. Pride can be, I should say that. Pride can be false humility, and kind of the avenue where we're headed right now is it's humility, but is it really in some aspects? I mean, have you ever ran into a person, and as I get into this, humility is having a modest opinion. False humility is pridefulness disguised. Now, can you think of an example of what false humility might be? You ever run into people that intentionally devalue themselves in an attempt to appear to be humble, even though they want accolades, they want acknowledgement, they want to be seen for what they did? Oh no, I don't thank me, right? Those type of scenarios. Is that humble? In many genuine, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and there are people definitely, but the reason I bring up false humility is because I think we get caught in this trap sometimes of, well, I need to be humble, and so, well, but I really want people to know what I did and or what I have, right? And unfortunately for us, that's not going to help us, right? It's not the humbleness that God's asking us to present. It causes us to think that we're acceptable to God. Oh, because I was humble and I didn't brag that I just bought the sports car, but I drove it all around town and made sure that everybody saw me, right? I mean, And false humility becomes a difficulty in terms of when is it false humility or when is it actually being humble. But we have to be cognizant of it. And that's the reason I bring it up. Because if our motivation behind it is, yeah, I'm going to try to be humble about this, but I really do want people to acknowledge it, we need to rethink that. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 And this quote that I have here, that false humility is the most narcissistic form of arrogance. That kind of puts it in perspective. And so Philippians 3, 2 through 11, and I am running out of time, so I'm getting nowhere fast today, so I apologize. Philippians 3, verses 2 through 11. Does someone want to read those? Or you can listen to me. All right. Beloved, now we are children of God, and it has not appeared as yet what we will be. We know that when he appears, we will be like him, because we will see him just like he is. Anyone who has his hope fixed on him purifies himself, just as he is pure. Everyone who practices sin also practices lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. You know that he appeared in order to take away sins, and in him there is no sin. No one who abides in him sins. No one who sins has seen him or knows him. Little children, make sure. Sorry, my screen just went away. I just lost what verse was I on? Sorry. That's right. I'm reading the wrong verse. That's why it didn't make sense. You guys got to catch me quicker than that, because I'm trying to battle between two different things here. So no wonder you guys are like, hey, that doesn't make any sense. Philippians 3, verses 2 through 11. Does someone want to read that if someone has it, since I was reading the wrong verse? Yeah. Thank you. I know that was a long one, but here's an example of what? Being outwardly religious for appearance purposes. Is that enough? We have a whole lot of that today in the world, right? People who profess to be religious, appear to be religious, but really aren't religious. And that's the fundamentals of false humility. This cartoon kind of puts it in perspective. With great humility, I humbly and publicly confess the biggest struggle in my life as a Christian is being right about everything all the time. It's kind of the perspective of that false humility that that might be present there. You know, we have to be cognizant of that type of attitude as well, because once that starts to creep in, it can start to affect us. It can start to pull us in directions that we don't really want to go. And I'm out of time. I got a whole lot more to go. So you guys are either going to have to stay for another hour, or I'm going to cut it right here. But since you guys have a great attitude tonight, you know, we'll end it there. But I appreciate everybody's comments and participation. Any other comments before I close for the evening?